Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. I have over 13 years of collective experience as a social worker and 5 years as a therapist. I specialize primarily with narcissistic abuse dynamics as well as dysfunctional family dynamics. I also work with couples using the Gottman method primarily as the main framework. I've been doing that for the last 3 or 4 years. So in this video, I'm going to just walk through some common patterns and strategies and tools that I use within my practice to give you some recommendations and things to think about in terms of helping your relationship. So stay tuned as I walk you through using Gottman primarily, as well as general experience from working with couples over the last 3 or 4 years. So there's many components to working with couples and to understanding how to help them. Primarily the main thing I'm doing when I first meet them is getting a good inventory and history. So I understand, one, the history of the relationship, and then obviously two, a bit of a history of them themselves in terms of how they grew up. Our family of origin shapes how we show up, communicate, and manage our emotions. And I've recently been reading this book called Us by Terrace Real. And in that book, he has many recommendations, but primarily he talks about the wise adult self and the adaptive child. He also talks about trauma, and so that can be the case that there can be relational trauma. And so when I'm working with a couple, sometimes that's a component, particularly in which they could still be triggered from this relationship trauma. And within a couples focused session, you're not focusing on particularly that person's trauma per se, but of course often it does come up. And usually you would think that it takes two to tango, and certainly it does within any relationship. No person is perfect, but you do find sometimes there is one partner that perhaps does have more what could be considered family of origin trauma or relationship trauma. If that's the case, then it could be that they could be projecting onto their partner or reacting from that child part, that wounded part, and there's nothing the other partner can say or do to give love to that part or appease it. Because it's relationship trauma, there's nothing, that the other partner can do or say to reassure or basically heal that part. So it takes the individual to do that themselves. Like self-soothing, this could be consideration, because if you think about a child, it could be the sense that it's a lower aspect of oneself. So it's a component which involves more of our base instincts and our emotional capacities. So based off of that, when one is reactive in a relationship, particularly around a certain topic, it could be the case that their trauma is being triggered from early childhood. But in other videos, I've talked about internal family systems and taking Terrace Real, his book, he talks about different types of trauma and how it can show up in a partnership. There's many aspects of couples, and he also mentions how there's no objective truth necessarily in a relationship, that there's relationship truth. And I would say that's often I see as the case, because typically, obviously, the two people often see the world entirely different. So they're in some sense they can both be true. Sometimes one is more true or more relationship based. Yeah, I guess that's the point in his book, is that both could have an aspect of the truth, but one is more anchored with the relationship truth. When a couple's arguing, typically it's the notion within Gottman theory of a gridlock issue. And so I mentioned that in another video. But Gottman talks about gridlock issues being common patterns of arguing, or where there's a gridlock and it doesn't get resolved and repeats itself. The couple can start turning away from each other. And when they turn away from each other, usually they're going to engage in the 4 horsemen. So that's excess criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. Over time, if a couple continues in that pattern, it's like acid on the friendship of the relationship. Every relationship starts with a friendship. If the couple is just not addressing the issue and they're not able to communicate, so it's two boats crossing in the night, never resolving it. That's usually what I see when I'm working with clients in my sessions, is that there's a fundamental miscommunication. This could be something that's resolvable. Sometimes it's a practical issue that could be talked through, but other times Gottman talks about it being like a philosophical difference. And also, if you take Terrace Real's book, there could be the notion, at least he says there's no objective truth. I don't know if I'd go that far, but I think what he means is that both people could be objectively have facts in terms of what occurred if they had like an argument. One is more relationship based. You don't necessarily have to agree with somebody, but you can never disagree with how they feel or what they took away from what you said. So if you resonate with that, then you can I think it's important to, I guess what happens usually is the person gets worked up and gets angry, and they typically engage in similar patterns that they've often engaged in, which leads to frustration or emotional overwhelm. If we also understand the fight and flight response, that's when our adrenaline gets activated and our prefrontal cortex goes offline. We're thinking from our base instincts and triune brain. We're not taking in any information. And they talk about being a hothead, or that more extreme cases where people completely shut off and they can kind of go into a rage. But most adults know what they're doing to some degree, but their adrenaline's going, they want to argue back, they start to raise their voice, and that just leads to the fight or flight response. It's not helpful because if those continue to occur over time, the argument can last a day or a few days or even weeks. That can just lead to resentment building, the four horsemen, right? As a general practice, if you're seeing yourself get escalated and your adrenaline's going, it's important to take a break. They say about 45 minutes to an hour is when the brain and the body can start to calm down. It's much more effective in a relationship when you can communicate from a calm place. That's also to note the wise adult self that we all have. There's also this notion of these child part, or just if you can think of just of having your inner child. And that's just a good reminder to see that in yourself. So that's some of the work that you do in the session, is talk about the emotions and how they showed up during one's upbringing. But then you also see how that shows up in the romantic relationship. Could be some relationship trauma. So it's understanding those parts, and that typically will take more individual sessions, so that person works with their own therapist. Take a break, calm down, allow yourself to reset. But then there's the notion of things that can be solvable. Some problems in a relationship are solvable. Others are philosophical differences. You can disagree with your partner and have different thoughts and feelings. At the end of the day, you can't necessarily argue with how they feel. I think it's also good to pay attention to the core emotions. That's anger, sadness, fear, pride, love. These emotions show up in the relationship and get expressed a certain way. And that's a good reminder of understanding yourself, how that growing up was for you, but then also for your partner, and then how is it in the relationship in terms of those emotions. And when there's a gridlock issue, we like to think that we're rational beings and we're always thinking level-headed, but I think, as we know, there's a tendency for us to often be much more emotional than we realize. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way that the human mind works. And especially when you're nearest and dearest, it's those emotions will be coming out. So I think it's important to have, one, an understanding of it, two, understanding from your partner, and then also understand how to process those emotions when they come up. But they might have deeper origins, again, of this adapted child self that Terence Real talks about. If there's a philosophical difference between two parties, I also just think sometimes about, while Carl Jung and existential philosophy and also psychology, it talks about the understanding that there's opposites in life. This is a very, philosophical understanding from a very early time, just the sense of yin and yang. And I see that in my practice sometimes, where the partners have completely different perspectives. It could be lifestyle differences, like maybe one is working full time, the other one's a stay-at-home mom, or just stays home, doesn't work. There can be both, there can be over-functioning and under-functioning in a relationship as well. But then also just the way that their upbringing and just who they are and their personality, their disposition, but also their experience currently can be expressed in kind of opposites. So at some level, I think this is what leads to sometimes the relationship having some of its spark, because opposites attract. If someone's more feminine and one's more masculine, that leads to more polarity, which leads to more sexual tension in a relationship. And that's a good reminder too, is that in a relationship, I find that especially couples that have been together for many years and married for many years, they have a lot of care and deep love for one another. So there's that friendship, but then they also have probably become complicit, or they've come accustomed overly to just the friendship and almost being like roommates. Perhaps they have young kids and their roles as a mother and father becomes primary, and they don't really necessarily foster the romance in the relationship. And so that's a good reminder too, is that you have to have a deep friendship and care and love, but then there has to be, I think, especially for men, there's also this notion of like always to be dating your wife. And so I think, so I speak about gender, and I use David Dida's work, and there's a notion that each person has their own constitution, so you can either be more masculine and have more of a feminine side. And a long story, but it's basically this notion of there's 3 stages of relationship. And so in the 60s, the 50s, it would be like the traditional sense that men would go to work, women would stay home. And so the gender roles were very much divided in that sense. And for good and for bad, right? I think we can understand there's some positives, but also some negatives and trade-offs. But then in the 60s, with feminism and birth control, women going more into the workplace, gender roles being more questioned, then there's a sense that men were able to express more of their feminine side and women were able to express more of their masculine side. So that's the sense of like women going to work and being more assertive and being more just more independent and autonomous and perhaps, just more assertive and directive. And whereas men have been able to adopt more of the softer skills and have empathy, care, and compassion, often are associated with the feminine. Within David Dada's work, he talks about the masculine being like consciousness or awareness, so just like almost like emptiness, whereas the feminine is the dance of life and the movement. The basic notion is that the third stage is where you have a constitution, so you know who you are. If you're more masculine, if you're a man, you're more masculine perhaps. For a woman, you're more feminine. You anchor yourself in those core aspects of oneself, but you can appreciate that in the relationship it can be expressed. You could have your feminine side in the relationship if you're a man and vice versa if you're a woman. That leads to a level of sexual polarity which is needed, and also just to go on dates. Gottman will recommend, depends on the couple, but at least once a month to go on some quality time together, to go on a date. And so that's usually a good reminder for couples. So I've been talking just about people. It's interesting too, because when I would say like almost like 90% of, almost 100%, I would say, working with couples has always been motivated by the woman. There's also interesting concept around that too, is that I've learned that sometimes women can be a little more socially developed because of evolution and the ability to be mothers, and they're more often attuned to the emotions and to just being more, they pick up on social cues much easier and can be more socially intelligent. Not always, men have that capacity too, but I think that often in my couple sessions, it's typically the woman motivating therapy, and women are more likely to seek therapy. Often I will see couples where plays into the trope of being aloof, not paying attention, and being not very attentive and not very emotionally attuned to their wife or to their partner. They very much need to lean more into their emotions often, and just to pay attention more to the relationship pattern of what's going on. Even if they feel like they're accurate or true about something, they also have to pay attention to, I would say, one, the inner child of their partner, but then also their emotion that's being expressed, and then speaking to that emotion. Often women will be criticizing the man, and then the man will get defensive, and then that will lead to him also being critical, and then it can lead to stonewalling and contempt. But often men, if they're more in their masculine, want to define things, problem solve, and determine, like put it into a box and define it. And so they're almost like trying to box the feminine in. Often I think with men, it's just having the integrity that perhaps your partner is saying something accurate, not reacting and getting defensive. It's not to say you should like take abuse or someone's really abusive or verbally abusive. Typically it's the case that the woman's trying to express something and the man can get, there's a notion of emotional overwhelm, and then they can likely get defensive. I think sometimes they actually know that what the woman is saying is accurate or true, but because they don't want to apologize or acknowledge it, they can also go on the attack. But the notion is that men at times need to lean more into their emotions, whereas women sometimes need to be more explicit and express what they're looking for and what they were like, not assuming that the man is going to pick up on these social cues. It takes both parties to understand how they show up in that capacity. But again, it's interesting that the women are often the ones motivating the relationship, like having counseling. I was reading in this Terrace Reels book, and again, mentioning just the notion of Carl Jung and the notion of yin and yang and existential therapy. There are often these opposites. And when I'm listening to couples in sessions, often I'm hearing two opposite perspectives, and then it's typical because they're getting into this gridlock or getting emotionally overwhelmed. There's the opposites in life, and because they're getting entrenched, often couples tend to not listen, especially if they're getting into the fight or flight response or emotional shutdown. They tend to strawman or assume what their partner thinks and dismisses them. And this can come from a certain level of contempt. The good thing about doing couples therapy is that if you have a good therapist, they can be charitable to both perspectives and give space for both of them to be heard in a new light, because obviously the therapist is more like a third party and more objective, giving space and capacity for the couple to see both perspectives more objectively or charitably. And a good reminder is that your partner could be coming from a different part of life, so two truths can be true at once. Appreciating that perspective, then listening maybe next time, then you can, okay, that's why they think this, and I think this way because of my experience. If you speak to their perspective you're more likely to have influence and they're going to feel heard. And that's another level of relationship dynamics. Influence. Does your partner, do they take your influence? Do you take their influence? And also just so some other things too is that sometimes couples, when they're not doing well and they're maybe closer to a breakup or to a divorce, is if, one, they're not taking each other's influence. They have gridlock issues that aren't getting resolved, and the four horsemen are coming up. Arguments are tending to get to a point where nothing gets resolved. It can happen for days sometimes. They talk about the end of the relationship. And then there's also in Gottman, the trust and commitment are like the walls. So they're like the foundation of the relationship. So especially if there's trust issues, that can start to question the commitment. And but then there can be these philosophical differences, and sometimes you just appreciate that in the session, as you can see both, and there could be both some truth to both of them, right? But it's just, and then that's also to know too that typically couples will explain that often what they argue about is petty. And I'm always, like, when I'm in a session, I'm always hearing from what is the position behind the words, because obviously they could be arguing about something silly. One didn't put the dishes away, or one didn't participate in the kids' sports, but it speaks to, usually there's like a grievance or something that it's been many times they've come across this issue, and so they get triggered more easily because it's something that speaks to where they feel like there's a deficit or they're not being respected or appreciated. And so that's what I'm paying attention to when I'm listening to clients, the surface level of the issue. But then there's the deeper disagreement. Comes back to the gridlocks. I like to think that sometimes there's like more than four, but usually there's two main ones and maybe like at most four gridlock issues. And if you take like Dave Ramsey, because he's a financial guru in America, just talks about the number one reason people get divorced is for financial reasons. The main argument is to do with finances. And I found that, that's usually number one or two, not always, but tends to be an issue. And other gridlock issues can be just, and this can also come down to emotional wounds and the family of origin wounds. Sometimes it's difficult because the gridlock issue could be around that. Sometimes the advice is to have one partner work on that issue more, either to themselves in terms of their own introspection or them attending therapy themselves. Sometimes they're not always willing to do that, but you're usually encourage them to do that. In a couples session, you speak to those traumas, relationship traumas, and sometimes it is an overwhelming issue because people have trauma. Until that's addressed, it is hard to get at the issues like communication. I think it is about communication in a relationship, but then there's also something about, it's interesting because usually both partners, and sometimes it's the woman, thinks that there's a fundamental issue or something that the partner's really not getting. At times that is the case, but everyone has their own perspective. Sometimes men could need coaching around being more emotionally attuned. Men can shy away from being more of like emotional processors, and this just could be their own upbringing and how their conditioning was. And if that's the case, then they could be more emotionally dismissive. It's helping those men, it could be seeing more emotions as being productive and not something to avoid. I think women don't always appreciate this, but men tend to just want there to be calmness or some peace, and I think women want that too. At times, men can get overwhelmed. In Gottman's theory, he talks about soft startups and harsh startups. And so soft startup would be something like being more pleasant to one another. And let's say that you're in the morning making coffee and you're saying, "Here, dear, I made some coffee for you." Just being a little softer in your tone and more pleasant. Whereas harsh startups, it's typical that because there's been some built up resentment, or one is just upset. It could be just the simple fact of you're tired and you're more irritable. And there's also the notion within a relationship of co-regulation. So because of person's circadian rhythms or just the way they're sleeping, it also could be causing some issues there. But if harsh startups is more the notion of just, you're going straight to an argument almost, and your tone is more harsh and critical. And so it's paying attention to that. So men sometimes will find that the woman's upset and then don't want to argue about it or don't want to discuss it. Often it's the case the woman wants to express it and wants to have it acknowledged or heard. But then the man, maybe one thinks it's not productive and it doesn't lead anything where nice or positive. And then so both parties get frustrated or irritable because sometimes then the man, because emotions have to go somewhere. So even though they might bottle things up and then express it with anger, there could also be the notion within like attachment patterns. So sometimes there's also the notion of being more avoidant, being more anxious, and then like anxious avoidant in terms of your attachment style. I have worked with couples where that can also be the gridlock issues, that the man will often, especially, it's also the notion of how the relationship started. So in this relationship, it didn't start very on secure base. So they were, what to say, not fully dating and also seeing other people at the beginning of the relationship. And this led to some insecurities, especially from the woman. And she would probably be considered more anxious attached, whereas he was more avoidant. And so whenever she would get more anxious and, what to say, not to say become more clingy, but being more looking for, like, she had a bid for connection and the guy would just not be present and feel smothered because of his avoidance style. This led to the couple having a gridlock issue around this, what was on a surface level, like a small issue about like where they're going to go next. I think was an event that they were going to go to, and they couldn't talk about it. And yeah, so then he avoided, and then she was anxious, and then it would lead her to become quite anxious and clingy, and it would lead him to not want to discuss it and avoid for days. So that's just to know too that attachment styles can also be a factor. Guy wanted to avoid, didn't want there to be arguments, and didn't see discussion of emotions being productive. But the woman would want to not bother the man and become overly emotional, but the communication wasn't being addressed. Sometimes as a couple, you don't always need to be processing things, and sometimes there can be too much processing. If emotions are always avoided, or there's no discussion or courageous conversations within a relationship, that's obviously also not healthy. And if one's more avoidant and the other one's more anxious, that can lead to underlying patterns. I think if the guy can be present and hear with new ears, and I think that takes both parties, right? Because again, usually both parties will get entrenched and then they're not really hearing each other. I think that happens to all of us, right? I think it's just a good reminder. They say beginner's mind. Sometimes it's about being present in a relationship. And if someone's more in their mind and they're more of a problem solver, or they're more of an engineer mindset, and not to make this all about types, but that tends to be sometimes men. So if they're more like an engineer type, they problem solve all day, or that's what they do, and they think very logically, analytically. But then in a relationship, they get overwhelmed or intimidated, sometimes even, by perhaps their woman expressing or being upset. And because they were never learned how to be present to their own emotions, it's hard for them to be present to their partner. Sometimes it's just them appreciating emotions being productive and thinking more relational. And then it's also appreciating the upbringing from both parties, particularly with the emotions. In this video, I covered different aspects of my experience working with couples in relationship counseling. And this is obviously not relationship advice. I would say you seek out an actual licensed relationship therapist. But I wanted to provide some common components that I tend to see within my practice and my reflections, as well as my own reading in this area. To understand how these patterns tend to work, I would say that some good books to consider is Gottman's has his marriage book. So I would say that's a good classic book to pick up, because it goes over like his relationship house and the notion of love languages. So it's like understanding your partner. It's talking about those like the trust, commitment, and gridlock issues. Also, are you going in the same direction? Are you guys heading in the same direction? That's important as well. I would recommend that book. There's also one for men's advice for women. That book's good too. It's a good reminder of a lot of things that men can pick up. And within that regard, David Dida, he has a book, The Way of the Superior Man. I would recommend that to men particularly. Some people find it controversial, but I find that, types, so that's just that in life there's different types, and one of those main types is gender. In that book, he gives good advice around men in just how to show up. I think it's good advice generally. And other books, like I mentioned, is Us by Terry. And also, there's a book called Nonviolent Communication. And some of what I take from that book is observing, not judging. Often when I'm working with couples, especially when they get more entrenched in their perspective and they tend to use more judgment words, they'll say, you always do this, or like, so they're more absolute statements. And so it's more to do than with the person's like the character or personality than objective facts. So I think it's a good reminder in nonviolent communications that instead of saying, you're lazy, you never clean up, you might say, hey dear, I noticed when I came home the last 3 times that dishes weren't done. Do you think that can you help out in this regard? And that's, people get frustrated, I think, and they start to go to the judgments or to the absolute statements. But I think that when one hears that, they tend to shut down. It's also knowing, and when I say this to my partner, they have this reaction and tend to close up Often what I'm finding when I'm working with couples is that body language is something to pay attention to, because you definitely see when couples are closer to one another, they will look at each other, there will be a mutual respect. When they're in their gridlock issue, they tend to turn away from each other. They might roll their eyes, showing disdain or contempt. They might, usually they're like cross their elbows, but they'll do subtle things with their body, and often I notice that they're not paying attention. I think they know that their couples, that their partner's doing this, but then they're also looking away and going into their own world. And in that book, that's one of Terence's point, is thinking less as individuals, but more as a we. So we're going in the same directions, one of them, but then two, like being on the same team. And that's often what I hear from couples. They want to be on the same team. They don't want to have this tick for tack or to always be at each other and competing with each other. That's part of it, having more of a we space and thinking more of his team. And just in that book, Terence goes through a paradigm shift. Sometimes what people will do is they'll retreat, especially in our society now. It's like everyone's encouraged to be an individual, and one can make an argument with feminism, not always needing a man and having more independence. When there's a gridlock issue, the couple will go into their own, in some sense, or being more into their own world and just being more self-reliant. But then they're also not happy because their needs aren't being met. That can often lead to the end of the relationship. So sometimes needs not being met in the relationship, the partner will seek that out in other relationships. And the question is what they need in the relationship. Usually there's some resentment built up because of that need not being met. And so sometimes, and often it's the case in the session, is myself as a therapist figuring out what is that need. It can come back to this child-like part of oneself. Sometimes it's like, can your partner actually do that for you? But sometimes it has to do more with processing that relationship trauma that occurred from a younger age. Sometimes it's unpacking that with the couples. They both have their trauma from their past, and they're trying to show up more differentiated in their life, but because they never had guidance, so from a young age, or had good mentors or people that showed a quality relationship, it's often hard for them to incorporate these different approaches or practices because it's never embodied to them or never something they saw growing up. That being the case, some of the sessions and one of the questions when working with Gottman is asking the couple what they see as a healthy relationship. And so sometimes because their upbringing, they didn't see a healthy family, maybe subconsciously some of their beliefs, their limited beliefs, is that they might not be as commitment orientated because of that. So that can also be one. But yeah, it's finding what is a healthy relationship. If you think about like a friend or somebody that you know in maybe your community, that is a healthy relationship. And obviously you don't always see the insides of a relationship. You don't always know what's going on. But to the degree in which you see them in public or something you can point to, I think it's healthy to consider that too, is think more objectively about some facts and then consider how you want to emulate some of those habits in your own relationship. It's always good to aim for something and visualize something. Sometimes we just default to our base level or the default mode. And the default mode can be based off of our child of origin and what we know growing up. But if we put ourselves in aiming higher and also seeing a healthier dynamic, then encourages us to live up to that ideal. And some of that could also just be studying and reading Gottman and considering what objectively needs to happen. And again, some of this comes down to understanding oneself and your partner, particularly in terms of the emotions. But then it's also having some awareness of communication styles and your own processing of emotions and how you're showing up. I think it's a good reminder to try to be more present, especially when gridlock issues come up, listening with more open ears, not assuming or going to judgment right away. Trying to reflect that and communicate that to your partners to say, hey, dear, I notice when you say this, I start to consider this, or this is how I'm thinking. Am I off here? And so you're at least being authentic with what you're experiencing. But then listening to them and understanding, okay, what emotion are they expressing? So not just thinking about the facts of the situation, but thinking, okay, it seems like they're upset, and I've noticed about them that they seem to get reactive about this. What might be going on for them? You understand that perhaps they're also speaking from a child part of themselves, and that just allows you to, I would say, have a little more empathy for them. I would consider that book by Gottman. David Dida has his work as well. That new book I'm reading, Us, it's been a good book. Yeah, in this video I covered some basics of understanding different dynamics that can show up in a relationship, particularly when there's been some challenges with a gridlock issue or communication that's coming up, and also spoke about attachment styles. Different types show up, the importance of fostering romance, thinking about dates and ways to have that caring, loving relationship, but also fostering the sexual tension as it is, because obviously there needs to be regular intimacy. And then I just spoke about different components of gridlock issues and how that shows up and how you can be more present, listen with new ears and try to hear for those emotions, but also the child part perhaps of the self. I also talked about relationship trauma and how both parties, if that's the case, need to seek out therapy or do some processing on their own to self-soothe with their relationship issue. Some of that consideration is also just thinking about certain wounded parts that show up. So there could be an abandonment issue or issues with safety or trust. And just knowing that your partner can't solve that for you if it's truly your own issue. And taking ownership and not projecting your child part onto your partner or subconsciously reenacting that in the relationship. There's many different aspects. I would say couples therapy is not easy. It's not always straightforward. Humans are complex, especially when there's two in the room. I would say it's interesting in the sense that it takes a lot of listening, and there's usually many aspects and components to the dynamic. And you'll see different parts of the relationship in the couple and also how they're showing up with one another. And so you also see them in their good time, but also in their bad time. So it's interesting from week to week. Some of these approaches and practices have helped in my practice. And I do think that, especially thinking about gridlock issues and addressing some of the differences that could be a philosophical difference, but also often have to do with the emotions, is important to consider. Yeah, I hope you like this video. Thanks and have a great day.